Hello, it's Professor Laura here. Today, we're going to be talking about primates and what makes a primate. There are a lot of different primates out there, and it's more than just monkeys. So today, we're going to talk about the characteristics that primates have, and then we'll go over all of the major primate groups. But let's start off with what is primatology? Primatology is the study of primates. There are so many different things you could look at within primatology. You can look at grooming behavior, social behavior, development, how they grow, mating behavior, anatomy, sexual selection, phylogenetics, territoriality, vocalizations, or the fossil record. This isn't even everything we look at. Primatology just means we're just looking at primates in some way. But let's first give this some context. So here we have a phylogenetic tree showing how mammals are related to other animals. So you can see here we are near the chimpanzee and the bear. So we're most closely related to the lizard, and then next to the newt and the sunfish. But let's zoom in a little bit. Let's look at mammals. So here is the mammal family tree, and we are right there in our contest shown here with our gorilla. The reason we're talking about this is there's different types of traits that we can talk about. These are primitive versus derived. Primitive just means old, and derived is new. All this means is a primitive trait, something old, that's been around for a really long time. We inherited that from a very old ancestor. A derived trait, now that is relatively new on the evolutionary timescale and is a much more recent adaptation of this trait. So when we're talking about primates, when we're describing them, we want to make sure we understand which traits are primitive and which traits are derived. So let's start with these primitive characteristics. We have DNA, but then again, so does every other living organism. We are also multicellular. We have bilateral symmetry. We have a vertebral column. We have four limbs. We have differentiated teeth, or that just means we have different types of teeth. We have internal pregnancy and fur. None of these traits are particularly exciting because we share them with a lot of other creatures, but they are still part of what make primates primates. Additional primitive characteristics, now we're getting a little closer, are pentadactyly. This is just a fancy word that means 5 fingers, penta for 5, dactyly for hand. We also have 2 lower arm bones. We have our radius and ulna. Some animals only have one. We also have a clavicle. This has been around for a while. And we also just have a rather generalized body plan. We aren't specialized like the bats who've transformed their hands into wings or the cetaceans that have transformed their hands into flippers. But let's talk about what's a little bit more exciting, the derived characteristics. Now we're talking about traits that are new to primates, and here's what really makes us stand out. When someone asks you to describe what a primate is, they are probably more interested in these derived characteristics than any of the primitive characteristics we just discussed. First, we have reduced olfaction. We're just not relying as much on our nose anymore. You can see this because we don't really have snouts at all. We don't have whiskers. Most primates don't. And the olfactory bulb in our brain is also smaller. You can compare this here to the dog. See how long their snout is? There's just more room for their nose. And if we look at those primates and include yourself, none of these have long snouts. Next, we have something called binocular vision. Our eyes are forward facing, and this means what can be seen by each individual eye, there's a big period of overlap in the middle. So that means we are really good at depth perception. Related to this, we have something called a post-orbital bar right around the side of our eye that is closed in bone. So if you poke the side of your eye, you can't actually poke your eyeball. But if you poke the side of your dog's eye, don't actually do it. You could poke their eyeball because there is no bone right here. We also, and here's my favorite one, we have prehensile hands and feet. That means we can grasp. And this is what I use when I want to hold something, like my tea. Next, we have what probably the most famous one is we have our opposable hallux and pollux. Those are just fancy words for our thumb and our big toe. Humans are actually the strange one here. Every other primate has an opposable big toe, but we've lost it so we can be more efficient than by beetle walking. We also have nails rather than claws, so we have a much more delicate grasps that we can do. Another interesting one is we have something called a diagonal sequence gait. You watch horses run, they actually have their right side of their body moved, then their left side. We go right, left, left, right. So we have a diagonal sequence in all different primates. Again, humans are a little bit different since we're walking on 2 legs instead of 4, but every other primate has this diagonal sequence gait. We also have this tendency for large brains. Humans have certainly taken this to the extreme, but if you compare primates to all other mammals, in this scale, red means we have a slightly larger brain. So within primates, there's more large brains than any other mammalian order. There's, of course, a range in variation. So you can see some examples here. These are all to scale. Obviously, the human brain's a little bit bigger than that. But we have a human, a great ape, and our Strepsirhines there are not quite as impressive, but overall we see larger brains in all primates versus other groups. Slightly less exciting, we have something called a petrosal auditory bulla. So that is just the bone right here on this side of their head. If you look at the very bottom, the auditory bulla is that thing that pops up. It happens to be made out of the petrosal bone in primates. It's made out of a different bone in other animals. We also have a slow life history, something we call K-selected or selected for carrying capacity. This means we see fewer children in each individual birth, increased parental investment, and a longer development and later reproduction. So overall, just a longer life history going on. This is in contrast to most mammals, which are relatively small, short-lived, and have a lot of babies all at once. It's pretty rare for humans to have a lot of babies all at once, and most primates only have one offspring at a time. So now that we've been introduced to the major characteristics of primates, both primitive and derived, let's start to talk about the major groups within primates and get acquainted with who they are. So here is our tree of primates. We have lemurs, lorises, tarsiers, New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, and apes. The first major division we have is Strepsirhines versus Haplorhines. So Strepsirhines, they have a rhinarium, they have a wet nose, they have a tapetum lucidum, or they have that eye shine, that thing when you see your cat's eyes glowing in the dark. Strepsirhines still have that. They also have a post-orbital bar and a tooth comb and a grooming claw. Haplorhines, they don't have that rhinarium. Like us, we have this dry nose. There's a space in between our mouth and our nose. We don't have that tapetum lucidum. We are not particularly good at seeing in the dark. And we have this full post-orbital closure rather than just this bar on the side. We don't have a tooth comb. And only tarsiers have a grooming claw. No other haplorhines have a grooming claw. You might notice that some of these are bullet pointed. So in italics, anything that is in italics, that is a primitive trait. Anything that is written normally is a derived trait. But let's look at some pictures to make them make a little bit more sense. So our Strepsirhines, here are lemurs, lorises, and galagos. You can find them in Africa and Asia. They were popularized in that movie Madagascar, so now everybody knows what a lemur is. We also have some other guys like this bush baby here. Most of these are nocturnal and solitary. There are a few exceptions, but most Strepsirhines are both nocturnal and solitary. So you can see the difference between a post-orbital bar and full post-orbital closure. You can see on this lemur here, there's a full ring around where their eye would be in this skull, but you could actually poke your finger all the way through that eye socket. But in this gibbon, you can't. There's full post-orbital closure there. But if you compare it to the raccoon, there's actually an open space on the side of their skull right near that eye socket. But now let's look within haplorhines. Let's look at the next groups. So now we have tarsiers versus anthropoids. Tarsiers, they're the subject of my dissertation, so they definitely have a soft spot in my heart. You'll find these guys in insular Southeast Asia, just the islands of Southeast Asia, and they're pretty much the best. They are a little weird. They've been isolated from other primates for a really long period of time, and they do tend to be a little bit different and not as well understood. You can see here they have nice sharp pointy teeth, and they do eat a lot of insects. But let's talk about our anthropoids. This is what you are probably already familiar with as primates. We have monkeys, apes, and humans. Now, most of these species are diurnal. They're active during the day. They have this full postorbital closure. You can't stick your finger all the way through the eye socket. And all of these guys have relatively larger brains. Within anthropoids, we can make further divisions. We have our Platyrrhines and now our Catarrhines. Platyrrhines means our New World monkeys. Rhine means nose. Whoever named a lot of these groups really like to define things based on noses. These guys have flat noses. You can see their nostrils are kind of pointing out to the side because that is flat. Most of these guys are arboreal. They live in the trees, and they're highly social. These are the monkeys. Some of them have these prehensile tails. They're spider monkeys, the atellids. So if you've ever seen one of those, that's where they come from. And on the other hand, we have our catarrhines, or our old world monkeys, apes, and humans. We belong to this group. So instead of those flat noses, now we have these hook noses. So our nostrils are kind of pointing down, and we have a little bit of a hook to our nose. And while many of them are arboreal, we also see many terrestrial species, and these are a little bit larger than our platyrrhines. And now we're seeing even more social behavior, and we have some primates that live in really, really large groups. Here are some differences between our platyrrhines and our catarrhines. You can see there's a little bit of differences in how the bones touch each other in our crania here. We have the difference between broad or wide nostrils versus narrow nostrils pointed down. There are also slight differences in the number of teeth. Platyrrhines have 3 premolars, while catarrhines only have 2. And there's also a little bit of a difference in the morphology of our ear bones. But looking within catarrhines, there are another 2 groups we want to talk about. We have our Cercopithecoids and our Hominoids. Cercopithecoids, these are our old world monkeys. We have a lovely little langur here. We see a lot of really big social groups in these guys. A lot of sexual dimorphism, so males and females look different from each other. And these are also super widely distributed, all throughout Africa and in many different places in India and the rest of Asia. These guys tend to be quadrupedal, and they have something called bilophodont molars, so they have sharp, nasty pointed teeth of death, mostly because they're actually trying to slice open leaves. And lastly, we have our hominoids, our apes and humans. I'm sure most of you are familiar. So we have, our gorillas and orangutans, but we also have our gibbons, or these smaller apes with our really long arms. So all of our hominoids, we don't have any tails. There are a wide variety of diets going on. Everybody kind of specializes a little bit differently. And we have a really wide range of social systems. What unites us is we have a certain posture called being orthograde. That's what I'm doing right now. My vertebral column is located up and down. It's because we think our early ancestors hung below the trees, and we have this really mobile shoulder. We could not play baseball like we do today without these adaptations to our shoulder joint. We also see really wide chests, and our scapula, or our shoulder blade, is located on our back. We also have a very short back, which isn't very flexible. So you can see here we have our ape in contrast to an old world monkey. You can see their back is much longer, much more flexible, and they have this really narrow rib cage, and their shoulder blade is actually on the side. So now that you're acquainted with each of these major groups, in these next couple videos, we will be going more in depth into each of these groups.